Okay, so welcome to our new course. By raise of hand, did anybody not receive the student textbook? You didn't receive it. You sure that you didn't get it in the mail? Did you check your email recently?
No, I didn't know you were going to send it. Is it a PDF file?
Yeah, there should be a PDF file. And if you want, I can send it forward to Sheila. I send it to you.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Okay.
The house. I'm sending it to you. I send it to you.
You know, we were also sent a whole Kabbalah article today. Have you ever done a class for that to learn about that?
For Kabbalah, yes. We had many courses on it.
I'd like that.
Okay, so I'm sending you. Okay. If you check your email, you should have the new student textbook. It's for lesson 1. And God willing, we're getting in our real textbooks over this coming week. So we will forward it to you. It looks something like this. Okay, lesson number 1. As you see from the name of the course, Beyond Right, the Values That Shape Judaism's Civil Code. So I'd like to first of all welcome everyone. Those of you who are watching on Zoom, those of you who are watching on social media, those of you who will watch in the future. This is going to be a fascinating course. We usually give courses on Jewish rituals or mysticism, different ideas. We had Mashiach, we had Kabbalah, we had Shabbos, we're going to focus in this course specifically on Jewish civil law. And we're going to contrast the Torah law with the civil law. And we'll see the source of the Torah law, which will all put it into perspective and hopefully make some sense. I'll tell you what this course is not. This course is not putting down any civil code. It's just contrasting different codes. Number 2, a lot that we'll learn about in this course will surprise you and may even shock you. And my goal is not to convince you how right this code is, but because then we can go back and forth for many hours. But today we're gonna start by going to the root of the Jewish civil code, where it comes from, and what the ideology behind it is, and then things will fall into place. And whilst we can discuss the case studies every week, we're going to have some case studies, modern case studies, see how civil law ruled, and then we're going to see how Torah law would judge if we were living in Israel under the Sanhedrin and the Jewish courts, how they would rule. And in many instances, it's different. And we are specifically focusing on the differences. So if it seems like at the end of this course, wow, Jewish law and civil law just don't run parallel to each other, the answer is because it's not exciting to have a course on where we have the same outcome. We're going to discuss cases where we have different outcomes. Now, we have almost an hour and a half to study lesson 1, although the material could last us 2 hours. So I'd like not to get sidetracked with civil law. I'm going to say up front, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert in civil law. At the end of each class in the student textbooks, it has all the case studies and what the civil law, what American law actually would rule. But that's out of my sphere. I'm going to discuss Torah law. So with that, we'll give you some time to ask questions in the middle after each section. And at the end, if you'd like me to stay on and take more questions, I'm more than happy to stay here. Okay, so let's begin. If you have your student textbook, we'll start, of course, from the beginning. Section number 1, the purpose of law. Okay, so since we're going to try to study the Jewish legal system, in order to understand any legal system, any rules or laws, then we would have to first look at the values of that society. So if you show me a country, a society, the laws of that country, that society, we can probably trace them back to the values of that society and its culture. So for example, all the Western democracies consider freedom to be a right, to be paramount, especially in America, right? Freedom, equality, these are basic values in the US and in many European countries. Although, just as a side note, the US puts a greater focus on individual freedom, whilst in many other countries, like I think even Canada, but definitely European countries, the focus is more on equality. So to give an example, what happened recently with COVID, right? During the COVID pandemic, in many European countries, they actually shut down. It was curfew. You couldn't walk outside after 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock p.m. That wouldn't fly in America. It didn't. Because we believe our focus is more on individual rights, individual freedom. Whilst in European countries, it's more about what's best for society, and therefore they have these restrictions, a tremendous amount of restrictions on movement in European countries. Another example would be freedom of religion. In America, there is a separation of church and state, and thus this free speech. You could basically say whatever you want in America, even if it's considered hate speech. I mean, there is a limit, fire in a theater, but you can say hate speech in America, can't be prosecuted for it, unless you're not faming somebody with. But in European countries, to talk and to speak against the against the Holocaust or anti-Semitism, that's actually illegal. You can be fined for it. Because our focus in America is much more on individual freedom, individual rights, whilst in Europe, it's more on equality or society, and thus there's more, the welfare, and everyone has healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. And why do we have more of a focus on individual freedom? And it's probably because of our history. The historical experience and story of the US. Right? We broke away from England, and where there was the opposite of freedom of speech, and we focused more on the freedom of speech. So yes, in the US we have the freedom of religion, but it's the government is not going to, probably not allowed to fund Christian or Jewish schools, whilst in Europe they do. When you have some people from Europe and France that come and they move to America and they're shocked, all of a sudden they have to pay for school. Right? And say, what do you mean? You're going to a private school? Yeah, but back in France they paid for my schooling, even though it's a Jewish school. But we take it for granted that church and state has to be separate because that's our focus. Our focus is not more about society; it's more about the individual freedom. Just to give an idea of the difference between societies, and you see that reflected in their rules, in their laws. Okay, that's one thing. So we're gonna, in order to understand Jewish law, we have to understand Jewish perspective, Jewish values, which we're going to discuss today. Another very important point, because sometimes, and I see this, many people ask me questions about it, people get Torah wrong. It's a wrong perspective on Torah. What is Torah? So if you have your books, you'll see in exercise 1.1 of page 2. What are we playing now? Now we're playing hockey and baseball, right? So in sports, you have what we call the umpires or the referees. If the referee has to talk for 15, 20 seconds, a minute before the game to the players, what is the referee talking about? The rules, right? He has the rule book. Okay, guys, no hitting below the belt, no check this, a whole bunch of rules. Guys, play safe, play the rules. Then you have the coach. The coach talks to the people too. Talks to the players. What's the coach talking about? Not the rule book, but the playbook. The difference is the umpire or the referee wants to ensure that the rules are being followed. That's it. That's the main focus of the referee. The coach wants the players to excel, wants to bring the best out of the players. Yes, there has to be rules, of course, and thus the coach will even make certain rules, so to speak, after the game, before the game, where the players can go, where the players can sleep, have to be a whole bunch of rules for the players, not because he's into rules, but because he believes, the coach believes that that's the best for the player. The player will bring out their best game if they follow these rules, and that's what the coach's focus is on. And in society, in life, we have some people that are like coaches and some like umpires. So a parent, for example, a parent can go either way, right? There's rules, but the parent is more like a coach trying to bring the best out of the child. Yes, there are rules. Parents have rules, but it's not about the rules. It's about bringing the best out of the child. On the other hand, the government, it's more about rules. It's more about the umpire, just ensuring that society, there's no anarchy. Everyone is, safe and everyone's following the rules. That's what the police are all about, and the judges and the court system. What is God? Unfortunately, some people look at God as the referee with a rule book. Judaism says no. God is a coach with a playbook. God wants to bring out the best within the human being. And thus he tells us how to live. In the boardroom, in the bedroom, in your home, out of your home, what we eat, where we go. It's not just about rules. It's more so about how we live, how we bring the best out of society and out of human beings. Okay, let's just try this spotlight here. So on your own screens, on the top right, I think view, you can decide if you want to see me or you want to see everybody. But just for the recorded video, I think it's going to spotlight this here. Okay, I see everybody. You see me, but you can always expand the view. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go out of order a bit because I think it makes a little more sense, even though they set it up a little different. I'm going to go straight to the case studies. Okay, so we're going to read the case studies. I'm going to do this by sharing. Let's see if I have the book here on the screen. Share it. I don't know. Okay, let's see a share button by me. So there we go. Share screen. Okay, I was hiding it. If you have your book, you can look in your book. If you don't have your book, we have the screen here. I'm not sure if it has the actual case studies. Okay. So I'm going to say the story because it doesn't have it on the screen, but I'm going to say the story, and if you can read along on page 8. Nicholas Young considered himself a lucky man, a German who immigrated to the United States in 1848. Young had worked hard to carve out a living for himself and eventually prosper as the owner of a mortuary in San Francisco. The business allowed him and wife Rosina to purchase a modest lot on the top of California Street Hill, where they built a quaint cottage-style home and planted a beautiful garden. Every day, California sunlight and fresh air would stream in through their windows. Young had no reason to believe that anything could interrupt his life, or that any one person could somehow deprive him of the beautiful days he'd worked so hard to enjoy. But Young also hadn't accounted for Charles Crocker, a very rich and very petty man who would eventually become both his neighbor and the bane of his existence. At 6 foot tall and 300 pounds, Charles Crocker cut an imposing figure. He had filled his bank account by being one of the big 4 barons behind the building of the Central Pacific Railroad. By the 1870s, he could afford whatever he desired. And what he wanted was to loom over San Francisco like a gargoyle. Crocker and his wealthy partners began scouting California Street Hill for its scenic views and proximity to the city's financial district. Soon, a group of wealthy men, including Crocker, were buying up all the homes on the chosen block. By the time Crocker was finished, he had erected a 12,000 square foot mansion with its new wealthy inhabitants. California Street was renamed Nob Hill. As the project neared completion in 1876, there was one nagging detail. On the northeast corner of the block, Nicholas Young was reluctant to sell. His cottage was dwarfed by the mansions going up, but he had come to enjoy the neighborhood. With one or both men causing acrimony, the end result was that Young was not moving. At a reported cost of $3,000, Crocker had his workers construct a wooden fence on his land that towered over the three sides of Young's home. With its 40-foot tall panels, the enclosure acted like a window shade, blocking out the sun and cool air and immersing Young in darkness. If you have your books, there's actually a picture there. We have Crocker's mansion, three mansions, and then you have Young's home in the middle. Charles Crocker built a big wall around Young's home. And while he bought this house because he loved the California sunlight, all of a sudden, the sunlight's not there anymore. And the question is, case A, should Charles Crocker's fence be allowed to stand? Okay. If you want, we can take two minutes or so. If anybody wants to unmute themselves and give me your opinion. What do you think? Should Charles Crocker wall stand, or do we listen to Young and say, get the wall down, you're blocking his son, even though Charles Crocker built it on his own property? Anybody? Nope. I think you couldn't unmute yourself. Don, try to unmute yourself and talk. Can you? I want to make sure this works. Can anybody unmute yourself and talk?
Yeah, I can unmute.
Oh, good. Okay, good. It's just nobody has anything to say. Are we a Jewish crowd?
We're thinking about it. We're still thinking.
You can think because we have four.
Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is, I guess the issue would be that the wall is technically interfering with the neighbors. I don't know, Dave. I mean, it's not a big deal in my opinion, but I don't know. I'm just trying to think of different issues. I don't know. Yeah. Right.
No, 100%. It's interfering with his sunlight, with his comfort. You know, that he loved the scenery, he loved the light, but now that's lost. And the question is, should we make him take it off? I mean, can somebody build anything they want on their property, even though it's going to hurt the person next door? Now, today we do have what we call spite laws, or spite fence laws, that if somebody builds a fence just to spite, with no other reason, then we tell them to take it off. So California has that law, at least. Some states don't. But at that time, they definitely didn't. So the question is, should he have to take his wall down? Okay. Let's go on to case.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I have an answer.
Sure.
I can tell you that it all depends. So that's the answer. It's a question of fact, for his peers and the jury of 12 people to decide whether or not that constitutes a public or a private nuisance. And they are given instructions by a judge as to what a private and a public nuisance is, and whether or not that has become a private or a public nuisance.
Okay, good.
So there is no clear-cut answer. There is no clear-cut answer to your question. It depends on the facts and depends by the triers of fact of a jury.
Right. So we basically gave you the fact. If these were just the facts, that they came in and in spite, just because they wanted them to move, they built this fence. So you say it depends on the judge, depends on the jury.
Again,
It makes sense.
Again, the question of what you've said is a conclusion. A conclusion involves spite.
Right. Well,
The question
today
becomes
we have
whether-
spite laws. Then those days they didn't have spite laws.
Well, I know, but whether or not you have spite laws, regardless of whether they're applicable in California or elsewhere, they're applicable in California and maybe not elsewhere. But it still revolves around a question of fact of whether or not your peers who are a jury that come from all walks of life
Right.
decide whether or not
That is the nuisance.
constitutes
Right.
that constitutes spite, which now involves the intent. And I gotta tell you, it's very hard to prove intent of spite in a courtroom.
Right.
So,
So therefore,
what I just want to say one more thing. The facts that you provided and that I saw in there were conclusionary. They were not. They were absolutely not factual.
So 1 second. In this course, you'll have to give me a little bit of leeway here, because in a court, anything that comes up, there's not going to be any conclusion until the jury and the judge goes back and forth for 6 weeks. I'm talking about here, if these are the facts and conclusions. If that's the case, if these people agree that this is why we did it, there's no two different sides of the story. The question is, would we have to take the wall down? And in today's day and age, with spite laws, you would have to. In that time, you'll see that perhaps they didn't have to. But we'll contrast it. Let's move on.
In California, you do, and outside of California, you don't.
Today, 100 years ago in California, you didn't have to. Okay, let's go on. Case study B, page 11. Rachel maintains a large and beautiful flower bed in her yard. But one day, her neighbor Joe built a high wooden fence between their properties that cast shade over the garden, causing the flowers to die. When Rachel asked Joe why his fence needed to be so high, she was told that it was necessary to protect his birds from cats entering the property. Rachel offered to replace the wooden fence with a glass screen at her personal expense in order to allow her flowers to receive sunlight without exposing Joe's birds to danger. But Joe refused to allow Rachel to replace the fence without offering any reason. So let's take for granted he built a fence, which is now blocking the sunlight to her flowers, and he built it on his property, wooden fence, for the cat shouldn't come in. And now she comes along and says, my flowers are going to die. Let me, my expense, put a glass wall up. Should Joe be legally required to allow Rachel to replace his wooden fence with a glass fence?
I say yes.
Then we should compel him to let her change his fence. Okay, good.
It's compromising. I think when you compromise with somebody, and sometimes when you compromise, both people won't be happy, but at least you're making an effort so that both of you can have peace in your life and not be burdened by something that is so selfish. Why be selfish? Why?
So good. You have a good point, and we'll get to that soon. American law usually doesn't work that way. If I have rights and I exercise those rights, whether I'm a nice guy or not, most often the court will not compel me to compromise and be a nice guy if I'm not infringing on anyone else's rights. So if I have a right to build on my side of the garden, maybe, I don't know, I'm not here to tell you what American law is, but this is a case that we're going to discuss in Jewish law. Another two quick cases, we want to get to the meat of the class. Case study C. Michael moved into a new house. Before setting up his own Wi-Fi connection, he realized that his neighbors had an open Wi-Fi network. Now, this is not mentioned in Talmud, right? Can Michael use his neighbor's Wi-Fi network without their knowledge? So there you go, you're in your house, and all of a sudden you go into your Wi-Fi and you see, hey, the neighbor's Wi-Fi is open, no password. Now, if I'm going to use his Wi-Fi, especially if he's not home, doesn't hurt him. He's not paying per gigabyte. He's paying his monthly fee.
What would be the difference with someone leaving their keys in their car?
And taking
That's not your right. It's something that's personal. They pay for it. Maybe ask permission, but we shouldn't take things without asking.
Okay. You say don't take without asking. Good. Okay. Now, I would say that
disagree.
perhaps the difference between a car and Wi-Fi is when you take someone's car, when you use a car, I mean, you can damage it, you can, people are very, self-conscious about their cars. I came there to park in the Chabad house, parked a little too close to someone's car and got all nervous, even though it's our parking lot. But Wi-Fi, the person won't even know. And it's not damaging them. If they're home, maybe it's going to slow down their connection. But if they're not home, they're on vacation, and it's an open Wi-Fi, I don't know. Good question.
If you want somebody not to use your Wi-Fi, then it's up to you to lock it out. I mean, they give you the option.
Okay.
And when you, according to the FCC, when you broadcast in the air, it's for the public. I
Okay.
mean, that if you had a two-way radio, it's the same thing.
So you say that would be an argument that you should be able to. Okay, good. Case study D, one more, then we'll get it to it. Sarah's next door neighbor, David, left on a lengthy vacation. It's difficult to find parking on their street, and David's driveway, situated smack in between their two homes, is now empty. Sarah wishes to park her car there while her neighbor is away. Should Sarah be allowed to park her car in David's vacant driveway without advance permission? So back in New York, and here, you have two houses, in the middle is a driveway, and this side of the driveway is this person's, that side's the other person's, and you have friends over, you have family over, and you know they're away on vacation. Can you park in their parking spot in their driveway without them knowing? Okay. Good
I
question.
would say, I would say no, because now it's somebody's private property and you're using it without their permission. That's a definite no, according to me.
I agree. Also, because if somebody were to get hurt, say, oh, God forbid, somebody were to fall or harm themselves, and it's not on your property, they're liable, right?
Okay, good. So it's, that's a good point. Good point. Okay, very good. These are 4 good cases, questions. We are going to answer all of them based on Talmudic law and the Torah law. And before we get to the actual law and the Torah, let's sort of contrast secular law or American law and Torah law. Modern secular law, what's the purpose of law, of modern secular law? So we all know that the Declaration of the Rights of Man was drafted, I don't know, in the 1700s. I think Thomas Jefferson was also involved there. And there were certain core values that were in this declaration. And if you look at the function of this Declaration of Rights, we see in text number 1, we'll go back to page 4, text number 1, and this is the Declaration of Rights of Man. Liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no limits except those which assure to the other members of society the enjoyment of the same rights. These limits can only be determined by law. Law can only prohibit such actions as are hurtful to society. Nothing may be prevented which is not forbidden by law, and no one may be forced to do anything not provided by law. Okay? So basically, according to this declaration, every person has the right to do what they wish. Right? That's liberty. However, if you give everybody the right to do what they want, you run into a problem. Then you have chaos, right? So you have to limit people's rights. What's the limit of my rights? Well, I have the right to swing my arm, swing my fist, but it stops at your face, right? I don't have the right to hit you. That's where my right stops. So that's the idea of human rights. Our rights are limited in order to protect and preserve the rights of someone else, so the rights of society as a whole. Right? So that's why we have a legal system in order to protect individual rights. And therefore you have public order, you don't have anarchy or chaos. That's in short. How about the Torah? What's the Torah rules, the Torah laws we call halakha? So for the purpose of this discussion and this course, we're not talking about rituals. We're not talking about keeping Shabbos or tefillin or kosher. Those are as we say in Hebrew, ben Adam lamakim, between us and God. We're talking about interpersonal conduct, civil and criminal law. And we find that right after God gave the commandments, the 10 commandments on Mount Sinai, it's Torah portion of Yisrael. Immediately after that is a Torah portion of Mishpatim. The Torah begins to present civil and criminal laws with the introduction, Eila HaMishpatim asher tasim lifneim. These are the laws you shall set before them. Right? You would think, after the 10 commandments, and Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, and what's he going to tell the Jewish people? I don't know, Shabbos, kosher, tefillin, mezuzah. No. He tells them the civil laws. If your ox scores somebody else's ox, then you have to pay him. Don't steal, return lost objects, all these civil. The question is, why do we need civil laws given by God when we can rely on man? People, we can create laws in our societies to stop anarchy but why do we need it from Hashem? Why is there a need for Hashem to give Jewish law in the realm of interpersonal relationships, interpersonal conduct? Okay. You think of religion, most people think of religion and they think of rituals. That's the realm of religion. But why should Judaism impose itself on civil and criminal manners? For what reason? Let human beings get together and decide that on their own. So Rabbi Abarbanel, Yitzchak Abarbanel, fascinating guy. He lived in the 15th century, a rabbi who was very, very influential in Spain during the Spanish Inquisition. And they tell a story about him that the Queen Isabel actually offered him to stay because he was so influential and so important. And he said, no, so I'm going with my brother, and kicked them out, I'm going with them. They even offered to keep a minion with him to try to appease him, but he refused. So let's look at text 2, the why of Jewish law by Abarbanel. Every human society requires laws. What is the advantage of God's Torah law over the legal system set up by other nations? Why does the verse state that these are the laws that you shall set before them, thereby telling us that these laws are a unique divine system exclusively given to us by God? The reason for this is that the divine laws contain elements absent from other legal systems. God's laws are based on the principles of compassion and goodness. It's pretty fascinating that in this text, Abarbanel tells us that the Jewish legal system differs from the secular system because it's premised on goodness, on kindness, on compassion. And this actually, the Torah says it itself in text 3. Shamar tishmur, observe Hashem's commandments, do what is right and good in God's eyes. Right? So Torah's law doesn't see its purpose as just protecting people's individual rights and preventing Reuven from harming Shimon. It wishes to guide us to be compassionate, rachamim, right? So it's not just about protecting rights, but it's about doing what's right. So going back to the referee example, secular law sees its purpose like a referee. It's not to ensure the players play well or win. The purpose is to regulate the players and to ensure they're not infringing on each other's rights or taking unfair advantage in the game by breaking the rules. But within the boundaries of the sports, from the referee's perspective, it's a free-for-all. On the other hand, Hashem, God, is like the coach. Coaches also want their players to follow rules, the rules of the sport, but that's not the definition of the role. A coach is guiding his players to be the best they can, to excel. And therefore, coaches instruct their players about playing styles, about tactics, about how they eat and sleep, and it's amazing. These players, they're Vons, big guys, 300 pounds, and they're 30 years old, and yet there's a coach telling them they have bedtime. They have to be at bed 10 o'clock before a game. They have to be at practice this time. If not, then they miss a game. It's not that the coach is sort of trying to be a ruler, but trying to bring the best out of the players, and for that they need some discipline. So again, God is not a referee, and the Torah is not a rule book. God is a coach, and the Torah is his playbook. Big difference. God wants us to do what's right and what is good. So in summation, secular law aims to regulate society, and Jewish law aims to shape it. Okay, so secular law is satisfied with protecting people's rights from infringements, right? And the question is, are anybody's rights being violated? That's really the question. In all these cases, is anybody's rights being violated? Because that's important to maintain a positive society. However, the Torah's perspective is, what is the right thing to do? That's its question. That's the fundamental value of Jewish law. That's its mission statement. What is the right thing to do? Okay. Let's take a look at text 4 before we get into the cases, the answers to the cases based on this, but we're building our case. Text 4, written by the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, page 7. There are two types of laws: laws that create life, laws created by life. Human laws are created by life. God's Torah is a divine law that creates life. Okay. So that's the difference between secular law and Jewish law. And this is one of the reasons of why religious Jews relate to Jewish law differently than people relate to secular law. And some people always, they ask me about this, it bothers them, so to speak. Raise your hand if you have learned law extensively. Okay, I know, other than Herman, anybody learned law? And the answer is, if you're not a lawyer, then there's no reason to learn law. Some doctors will learn, malpractice law, but lay people don't study law. They get legal advice from a professional who learned law. And yet you go into yeshiva, in Jewish education. I began studying Talmud when I was, sixth grade. Today, if you go to a yeshiva with bar mitzvah boys, 14, 15, 16-year-old bachurim, yeshiva bachurim, they're spending the majority of their time learning Talmud. 6 hours a day, 7 hours a day, focused on Talmud, and there's many tractates of Talmud which talk about civil law, about criminal law, about Metzia, about Kama, about Basra. You learn about marriages, about divorce law, and we go through it all. And the question is why? I'm not going to be I'm not going to write divorce contracts. I mean, I've been a rabbi for 25 years. I never did. I don't plan on writing divorces. Or get marriage certificates, fine. But I learned the laws of salting an animal, koshering an animal. You go to the butcher today, you don't need it. Why are we spending so much time? Why do the students so much time on Talmud, on civil and criminal law and other law, when it seems like it's unnecessary? It seems like, why would somebody want to go through law school, 4 years of law school, studying law 10 hours a day when they're not going to become a lawyer? It seems like a waste of time. And the answer is because we don't look at the Talmud of Jewish law as a technical system that we have to be in compliance with. We look at it as an expression of Hashem's wisdom that aims to shape our character and guide our actions. And therefore, Jewish law needs to be studied in depth and its values internalized to sort of shape us, to know what God wants of us. So today we're going to get a taste, today in the next 5 lessons, a little taste of this Talmudic law and study, and how we come to see and learn values while we're learning Talmudic law, civil law, criminal law, and how we get to the source of the system, which is its values. So we already went through the case studies. We just gave you a little background of the basis of Jewish law. And I'll give you a couple examples. If you look on page 12, as we mentioned at the text 2, text 3, that the purpose of Torah law is to shape us to be compassionate and do what's right. Here we have some examples in figure 1.1 of what does it mean to do what's right and good. So for example, mitzvah number 1 here, do not stand by when somebody's life is at risk. If somebody's life is at risk and you can save them, Torah says you have an obligation to save them. The example given there in Rashi, if you see somebody drowning and you can swim, you jump in and drown them. It's your responsibility. American law, secular law, would very seldom tell you that you have to save somebody. There are some instances, but the general rule is, if you're walking on the beach, you see somebody drowning, you don't have to jump into the water, 100 feet down to actually save them. Maybe if you're a lifeguard, it's your job, but otherwise, you don't have to. Torah says you have to jump in. You have to, don't stand by when somebody's life is at risk. That's number 1. Number 2, another example, right here in figure 1.1, we have a pick up any lost object you encounter and return it to its owner. Hashavas Aveida. It's a mitzvah, it's obligation in the Torah. If you find something on the street, now secular law would tell you once you pick it up, maybe there are laws that you have to return it, but you don't have to pick it up in the first place. Torah says you can't walk by that object. You have a responsibility. You saw it, you pick it up, and you find the owner. That's in Deuteronomy 22, verse 23. Number 3, roadside assistance. You say, what? The Torah talks about roadside assistance? Yes, the Torah says if you see your friend's donkey and under its load, you have an obligation to help him pick up the donkey and relieve it of its load. So you have that, you have obligation. If you're driving down the 405 and you see a car stuck on the side, you don't have responsibility to stop and help them out. I always tell the story, many of you probably heard it, of the guy on the Route 17 going up to the country, up to the Catskill Mountains. And he's Hasidic guy, he goes up and he sees this guy on the side of the road with his hood open. And he's wearing this little kippah, this yarmulke. So he stops over on the side, he helps him out. And the guy says, thank you very much. And as he gets back in the car, he takes his kippah off. And the chassid asks him, what do you do? You're Jewish or not? He says, listen, I'm not Jewish. He says, why do you have your kippah? Because I live here all my life. And one thing I've noticed is anytime there's somebody on the side of the road that has one of these things on his head, there's always somebody helping him. So I keep one of these in the glove compartment, and this way, this is my roadside assistance. But Judaism does say that if you see somebody's donkey on the side of the road, you have an obligation to help it. A 4th example, which is a big contrast between Judaism and secular law, is don't spread gossip. The Torah says it's a prohibition to gossip. If that would be a secular law, you can take half of the magazines or 3/4 of the magazines off the shelves. There's no, unless you're defaming somebody, there is no prohibition about gossiping. But we see, and why are these laws Torah laws versus the contrasting secular laws? Because the Torah doesn't look at rights, the Torah looks at responsibilities, the Torah looks at the asisa hayashar v'hatoiv, do what is right. Torah is God's playbook, trying to bring the best out of us. And therefore, it expects of us more than secular law that is simply looking after individual rights. Okay, now let's go on to take a look at the Torah's teaching, and with that, we're going to go into the answers for today's question, today's scenarios. Okay. And this is Nachmanides. Nachmanides explains to us what the Torah means when it says you shall do what's right and justice, right and good in God's eyes. Let's take a look at text 5. It's page number 13. And then we're going to get into it. So our sages expound upon this verse and explain that it instructs us to go beyond the letter of the law. When it says you shall do what's right and good, it means go beyond the letter of the law. In other words, the Torah first exhorts us to observe all of God's commandments, And it now instructs us to be careful to do that which is right and good, even when not explicitly commanded to do so, because God cherishes good and proper conduct. This instruction is very important because it would be impossible for the Torah to exhaustively address all of our conduct with our friends and neighbors, all of our business affairs, and the welfare of our society and the world. Instead, after offering multiple specific commandments, such as you shall not go around the gossip monger, you shall not take revenge or bear a grudge, do not stand idly shedding your fellow's blood, do not curse even a deaf person, stand in the presence of the aged, the Torah then concludes with a generalized command to do that which is right and good, meaning go beyond the letter of the law. So what is Nachmanides telling us? Nachmanides explains that after the Torah tells us all these laws, specific commandments, we ask somebody, how many commandments are there? Many people will say 10. There's a lot more than 10. There are 600. 10 was just the beginning, getting us started. The Torah tells us 613 laws. Like we mentioned a few of them: stand up for the elderly, return a lost object, help your neighbor, etc., love your fellow as yourself. And then the Torah can't tell us every detail, every scenario that's going to come up in society. So therefore, it gives us a general idea, a general rule: do what is right and good. Okay, do what's right and good. Actually, Chassidus compares it to a body and a spirit, but we're not going to get into that right now. Do what's right and good means going beyond the letter of the law. Now, can we be obligated to go beyond the letter of the law? If it's the law, it's the law. If it's not, it's not. Yet, our sages tell us that we, as human beings, as followers of the Torah, have a commandment with this verse to go beyond the letter of the law, and the Sanhedrin, the courts, can actually hold them up. And as we'll see in a couple of minutes. So, while the spirit of the law, which is beyond the letter of the law, cannot be specified in every scenario, the sages tell us that we can't just leave it to personal judgment, because then everyone's on his own. And therefore, the sages gave us guidelines what it means practically. Yasisa Yosher V'Atoiv, you shall do what's right and good. And this is the guideline it gives us. It's fascinating. If you learned a Talmud, if you learn a Pirkei Avos, Ethics of Our Fathers, text number 6 tells us, Koifin al midas daim. A person is compelled by law not to act in a manner like the characteristics of the people of Sodom. What did the people of Sodom do wrong? There were 5 cities. One of them was Sodom. 2 famous ones were Sodom and Gomorrah. It was Admah, Tzvoyim. The people of Sodom were wicked people. They were notorious for their wickedness. Some people think that the wickedness was just with sexuality, etc. Thus we have the term sodomize, but it was all across the board. What was the characteristic of Sodom? What did they do wrong? How do you characterize somebody as a sodomite person? So in text 7, we learn the Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers. And this is fascinating. It says, Ha'omer shalish shali v'shalach shalach. If somebody says, what's mine is mine, what's yours, it's yours. So let's back up a little. The Mishnah begins, if somebody says, what's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine, that's a Russia. That's a wicked person. If somebody says, what's yours is yours, what's mine is yours, it's a righteous man, willing to give away his to everybody else. How about if somebody says, what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours? So there's 2 opinions. One says, that's just Beinanis. Beinanis means it's, in average. It's an average person, average character. The Yeshayimrim and others say, that's like the people of Sodom. Now, it's a very puzzling Mishnah. How can there be such a sharp disagreement of a person who says, what's mine is yours and yours? One person says, that's average. Another person says, no, that's Sodom. That's Sodom. It's so far apart from each other that how can you sort of justify these 2 opinions? And the greater question is, okay, this person is not a saint. He says what's mine is yours is yours. He's not a saint. But to call him a Midas Sidoin, he's acting like a person of Sodom. I mean, he's acting within his rights. What's wrong? So the Meiri answers in text 7b, both statements in the Mishnah are valid, because the second view, which classifies such conduct as wicked, as Sodom, refers to those who refuse to permit others to benefit from them, even when they will incur no personal or monetary expense as a result. Such conduct is characteristic of the inhabitants of Sodom. By contrast, the first view in the Mishnah, which tells him he's an average, refers to those who refuse to allow others to benefit from them when doing so would come at a personal or monetary expense. Individuals who adopt this approach cannot be compared to the inhabitants of Sodom because they seek simply to avoid incurring losses through the actions of others, just as they would not inflict a loss upon their fellow. This indeed reflects the average character. So Meiri is explaining basically these two opinions by saying it all depends on the details. A person is not willing to do a favor for somebody else at his own expense. That's an average guy. An above average guy, an above average person, would actually take a loss to help another person. As the saying goes, give until it hurts. And Judaism says, when it hurts, that's real giving. That's a righteous person. A righteous person will give when it hurts. But if you don't give when it hurts, you're okay, you're an average person. But the opinion that says that this guy is a Midas Sidoim, that's referring to a person who refuses to do a favor for someone else when it comes at no loss for himself. In Hebrew, it's called zenene b'zelei chaser. Somebody else is gaining, I'm not losing. Yeah, it's within my rights. But that's what the Mishnah is telling us. A person that stands on his rights, just exclusively on his rights, instead of doing the right thing when he has nothing to lose, and his fellow has something to gain, that is like a Sodom-like character. That's an ethical principle. Somebody can gain from you without you losing anything, and you still say no? Why not? And I didn't want to point this out because it's going to be important, because right now we're going to go back to, actually, yeah, we're going to go back to our case studies. It's very important. We live in a society in a time that may be difficult to understand this and appreciate this, because we live in a society, we were born into a society that is predicated on rights. What right do you have to use my thing? It's mine. But you're not going to lose anything. It doesn't mean absolutely no negative effect. Doesn't matter. It's mine. It's all about my personal rights. I don't care if you're going to gain or not. I don't care. It's my property. And I understand that. So it'll be very difficult for some to make that shift. And it's okay. But we're going to study today where Talmudic law comes from, where Jewish law comes from. And if we understand, we sort of internalize this source, this ethical idea, like Hashem being the coach, trying to bring the best out of his people through this playbook, not rule book, but playbook, I think we'll get a better appreciation on the opinions and the conclusions we'll get based on the Talmud on these case studies. Okay, so now we're going to go into the case studies based on cases that were brought up in Talmudic times, in the times of the Mishnah or the Talmud.
Hi.
Yeah.
You know, you talked about compassion,
Mhm.
you know, and when I watch the news or I listen to my husband's stories of his students, he's a teacher for LAUSD, and how angry people are. These young kids, so angry. We need to teach our kids compassion, right?
I agree with you 100%.
And it's heartbreaking that, you know, people are going to a church to kill.
Yeah.
You know, and the hero in that you were just talking, I was thinking about the hero in that situation. Saving the old people. Oh,
Yeah, 100%. And that's why some people look at Talmudic students and say, you guys are wasting your time. If we understand that Talmudic study, Talmudic law is based on ethics, it's based on doing what's right, we're inculcating these ideas in sixth graders, fifth graders, seventh graders by studying Mishnah, not just the cut and dry law, but the reasoning behind the law and the compassion behind the law. We're instilling within them compassion and doing what's right, which I think is more valuable 6 hours a day than teaching them cut and dry, information that many hours a day. Which is why we are engrossed in Talmudic and Mishnaic and halachic study so much, because this is Hashem's wisdom and Hashem's gift for the world to be a loving and peaceful place. So let's go on to the thank you for that for sharing that. Going back to the first case. Okay, so the case of the window of the we're going to learn a case of a window in the Mishnah, based on the Rambam. Let's sort of paint the picture, because we don't live 1,000 years, 2,000 years ago, so sometimes it's a little hard to appreciate. You have a house with a nice view, and then the property next door, a guy starts building and builds up taller than your house, and now you lost your view. You'd be upset? I imagine so, especially if the view was a nice ocean or mountaintops. To take it a step further, in the ancient times of the Talmud, even the time of the Rambam, people had windows not for views, but their windows were for sunlight. That was their source of sunlight. They had no electricity. So here you are, build your home, you build your windows because you needed sunlight, and all of a sudden, this guy builds next to you on his property, but a couple feet away from you, all the way up above your windows. Now your house is engulfed in darkness. A problem. What rights do you have? So let's take a look at this Maimonides, and I think this will answer our first case study. We're at page 18, text 8. A person has windows set in the lower portion of the wall of his house, and his neighbor desires to erect a building that would block them. The neighbor proposes to solve the problem by installing new windows in the upper portion of the homeowner's wall. If this arrangement won't cause the homeowner any difficulty at all and would not require him to leave his home during the construction, he cannot prevent the new neighbor from performing this construction. The homeowner is compelled by law to allow the neighbor to close the windows in the bottom part of his wall and create new windows higher up. This is because it would be Sodom-like conduct for the homeowner to refuse this accommodation. This principle applies to every situation in which one individual will benefit while his fellow will not lose anything as a result. In all such cases, the relevant party is compelled by law to cooperate. It's a fascinating law. And let me sort of, like I said before, sometimes it's hard to comprehend when we're in our framework of rights. The homeowner is within his rights to object to his new neighbor building his house above his windows that would obstruct his light. But Maimonides teaches us that if the neighbor offers a solution, and this is the key, that would come at no expense to the homeowner, no expense, not even inconveniencing him, he wouldn't have to move out of his house. A Jewish court would compel the homeowner to allow his neighbor to build. Right? Again, it's not the neighbor would have to pay for it. I mean, the neighbor would pay for it. He would have to build it. Again, we think of windows as views. In those days, windows were for light. So if you build, if there's this tall ceiling, and you could pick up the windows, close these windows, pick up the windows higher, so you still have the light, and he won't lose anything. In this case, it's a zen nene v'zel lecha, so this one gains, this one's not losing, and therefore the Rambam says we would compel the homeowner to allow his neighbor to build. Let's say the homeowner insists on not allowing the neighbor to make the changes. Right? So then the court would say, okay, so your neighbor can build his wall as high as he wants. We're giving you a solution. Okay. So that's That's the case the Rambam says. So how would that apply to our case? Let's take a look at remember case study B? Rachel wanted to replace, what's his name? Rachel wanted to replace Joe's fence with a glass fence, the glass screen, right? And Joe says no. Why? I don't know, don't want it. He doesn't give a specific reason. He just, I don't want you to mess with my fence. If he says, no, I don't want a glass fence because there's no privacy, I build this for privacy, whatever it is, okay, then he has a good cause. He's losing something. But if he doesn't, he's not losing anything. He simply does not want allow Rachel to put a glass fence instead of a fence. Then we can compel him. The court can compel him to allow Rachel to change the wood fence into a glass fence. Now remember, Rachel's paying for it. And he's not losing anything. She's gaining because now her flowers will grow properly. We can tell Joe, you have to let Rachel change your fence and erect a glass fence. Okay. Any objection yet? Okay. Now, how would this apply to case study A? If it applies to Rachel and Joe and the birds and the flowers and the wooden and glass fence, how much more so it'll apply to Nicholas Young's case? Because there, the only reason they put up the fence was to spite him. And that is Sodom-like. That's conduct like Sodom. And Jewish law would therefore forbid a spite fence. It means if we can determine that Christopher, whatever his name was, did not put up the fence for any benefit of his own. He simply put it up to spite Nicholas Young. The Jewish court would say, you got to take down your fence. Because it's a zenena, the zele chaser. One is gaining and the other is not losing. Okay. Now, in the 19th century California, this guy Crocker's fence was considered legal and it was allowed to stand. Right. Since then, as you mentioned, many states, including California, did enact spite fence laws, and that those spite fence laws prohibit, if there's no other purpose for the fence, we say no, you can't build them. But in that time, it was before spite fence laws, and therefore that fence was allowed to stand. That wall was allowed to stand. Okay. Now, in today's day and age, even today with spite fence laws, Joe's fence, that wooden fence to keep out the cats, it would be allowed to stand because it's not a spite fence. He did it for a specific purpose. He wanted to do it for the cats should not go, the cat should not come in and eat his birds. Okay, so court of law, even in California, would say, I'm sorry, Rachel, you can't force him to change his fence, even if you were willing to pay for it. Sorry, it's not a spite fence. He'd be a nice guy to change it, but we can't compel him. Judaism would say, zenene v'zele chaser, this one's gaining, this one's not losing anything, and therefore you have to allow Rachel to change your fence. Now, of course, it has to be determined that he's not losing anything. If he's losing any money or inconvenience, then we can't compel Rachel to do it. But if he's not losing anything and she's gaining, we call it the midas Sodom. It's a sodomite. It's a conduct of Sodom, and therefore he has to let her put up the glass fence on his property. Why? Because the default reference is not what is my right, but what is the right thing to do. That is ingrained in halacha and Jewish law. Okay, we'll get back to the Wi-Fi and the parking lot soon. Oh, take 36 already. Okay, don't worry, we'll end on time. But I want to talk about another case that came up, which we call it's been quite common in some places in America today. It's called squatters' rights. Okay, So up until now, we've discussed compelling a person to remove a fence on their property that helps somebody, that hurts somebody else for no purpose. But Jewish law takes this Sodom-like conduct even further. Squatter, you all know what a squatter is. Somebody comes into your property. Let's say you have a house that's you're not living in, who knows where, in Tennessee, and somebody is squatting on that property. The question is now, he's been squatting there for 3 months, 4 months, and now you catch him there. Does he owe you money for rent? Or is he allowed to squat there? Is he going against the rules? Can you kick him out? You have to let him stay. This is all discussed in the Talmud. Let's take a look at text 9. The exact case in the Talmud. Text number 9 here. Taken from Talmud Bava Kama. If one lives in his fellow's yard without the latter's knowledge, does he have to pay him rent or not? The question is in regard to a yard that is not on the market for rent, but the squatter is a person who usually rents. What is the law? Can the squatter say to the owner, what loss did I cause you? You're not living here. Or perhaps the owner can insist, look, you have benefited from my property instead of paying rent elsewhere. This is a case in which one individual benefits while the other does not lose anything. The Talmud concludes, Rabbah, the son of Rav Huna, stated, my father ruled in the name of Rav that the squatter does not have to pay rent. Okay, wow, this is fascinating here. What's going on here? Very important to read the details of this Talmud. Number one, it was in his fellow's yard. Yard is different than a home in that a yard more is less chance of depreciation or ruining anything. Obviously, if this person ruined anything in the house or depreciate anything, he has to pay for it. But he's in his fellow yard. And another important point, if you look at the second paragraph, a yard that is not on the market for rent. If this yard was on the market for rent, the commentaries say, it would be different because then the owner is losing. Here he's trying to rent out the house. People come by, they see somebody living in there or somebody in the yard, they're not going to rent it. They're not going to ask him to rent it. So he is losing. But here we're talking about this guy doesn't live there. He's not looking to rent his house out. And he finds out there's somebody been living there for 3 months. So Rabbah, the son of Huda said, based on his father, that the squatter does not have to pay rent. Why not? So the simple answer is, as we mentioned before, what's the source of the Torah? Because the owner didn't lose any potential income by the squatter living there, right? The squatter gained, he didn't lose. That's fine, right? The squatter gained because otherwise he'd have to rent a place. This guy didn't lose because he wasn't renting out his place. So it's a win, it's not a win-win, but a win and no loss situation. And therefore the squatter doesn't have to pay anything for his unauthorized use. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Herman, but I think in America and secular law, if I gain something from your property, from your possessions, even though you didn't lose anything, I have to pay. Is there a term for that? No? Where's Herman? Oh, you would be muted. I think there's a term for that, for benefiting of somebody else's property and having to pay that person for it, but I'm not 100% sure.
Well, Rabbi, it has to do with if there's no damages, then you don't have a cause of action.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then I'm wrong. Okay.
Period. That's that's one of the elements of any civil case. If you don't have the damages, you have lost an element. You can bring the case, but you're going to get thrown out before you even get started.
Mm-hmm. So over here, we talk, I think at the end of your books, there is a concept called unjust enrichment. One person is enriched by another in circumstances the law sees as unjust. So when unjust enrichment occurs, the recipient of the benefit is obliged to make restitution for the value of the benefit derived. Yeah, I'm sure there are limitations to that law, yeah. But the Torah tells us here, based about it, Talmud tells us here that as long as the squatter is gaining and the owner is not losing, then he doesn't have to pay. But this case is a little different. If you look closer, the entire Talmudic discussion is about whether the squatter has to pay after the owner demands that he pay him. There's no deliberation in the Talmud whether the squatter can continue to live there. It doesn't say, oh, the squatter is permitted to live there. No, the squatter, you can get the squatter out legally in Jewish law. But the question here is, does he have to pay back rent? And the answer is no. Why? What's the reason? So there's an interesting Tosafos. Tosafos is was actually the original Tosafos were the grandchildren of Rashi. So in every Talmud you read, on one side there's Rashi, on the other side there's Tosafos. Because we only compel the property owner not to conduct himself like an inhabitant of Sodom regarding the past. The squatter who resided on his property without paying rent is not compelled to pay him rent for the past. At the same time, it is clear that the property owner has the right to protest the squatter's presence and need not permit the squatter to remain on his property. So on the one hand, it seems like the squatter, he can stay there if nobody knows, doesn't have to pay rent because he's gaining, the other guy is not losing. But once the owner finds out, he doesn't have to pay the owner rent, but the owner can get him off. The question is why? What would be the reason that once the owner knows, all of a sudden it's not Sodom-like, Sodom conduct to let him stay. It means to kick him out. It wouldn't be Sodom conduct. So there's an interesting commentary that gives us the reason. The commentary's name is Rav Shimon Shkop, and he gives a reason on why after the owner finds out, now he can get the squatter off. He doesn't have to let him stay. Even though it seems like same thing applies. The owner is not losing and the squatter is gaining. So he says as follows, text 11, page 22. In my opinion, the reason the Tosafos rules that the property owner cannot be actively compelled to allow a squatter on his property is because compulsion in such an instance would be a forcible negation of the property owner's control over his own property. Most people would object to this. The failure of an individual to consent to something that most people would object to cannot be considered Sodom-like conduct. However, the squatter's presence on the property without the owner's knowledge doesn't negate the owner's control over the property because the owner retains the right to evict the squatter at any time. It's a very interesting idea, he says here. Rav Shimon Shkop explains that most people consider control over their property as an integral part of their ownership, right? And as soon as they lose that control of being able to decide what goes on their property, then they're losing something. They're losing sort of control, autonomy over their property. And therefore, as long as the owner didn't know, he's not losing any time, he doesn't know. And he can still kick the guy out whenever he does find out. He's not losing anything now. He doesn't have the knowledge. In his mind, he still thinks he has full control over his property. Fine. But Rav Shimon Shkop said the key here is there a reasonable basis for the person's objection? Means, is there some loss? If there is loss, not even financial loss, if there's any loss to the owner, then he doesn't have the obligation to let him stay, right? Just as financial loss is a reason to get somebody off, so too is loss of control. Loss of control of one's property. That's reasonable grounds for objection. And therefore, it's not considered Sodom-like to kick him out. It's interesting idea. So when it comes to squatters, now if there's, in most cases, a squatter would incur a financial loss to the owner. You walk by houses that have squatters, and you see they're not in the same shape as houses without squatters. But in those days, in the Talmudic times, people had big fields, big properties, and they had properties here and there. So somebody's on your field, and you don't even know. is no loss to you. But as soon as you know there is some sort of loss, and therefore you have the right to get him off. You have the right to get him off. Would it be praiseworthy to allow him to stay? Yes. If he's not damaging anything or not bothering anyone. Yes. Remember, going back to the Mishnah said that if someone says what is mine, what's yours is average. And that's referring to if there's no loss. Sorry, if there is a loss. Yeah, if there is a loss, it's average. If there's no loss, and he says that, then he's a Sodom. But even if there is a loss, you should still go beyond the letter of the law and help other people. The court will not force you to. You won't enforce it, but nevertheless, you should do that. What the court will enforce, based on to do what's right, is if there's no loss to you and a loss to him and a gain to him, then they'll enforce it. An example of that, which is not in this lesson, just that it came to mind, there is halacha in Shulchan Aruch that if I walk into a shul, and I left my tefillin at home, my talis at home, can I use another talis or tefillin that has a name on it? I know it belongs to somebody individual. There's no more talis and no more talis in the shul. Everyone's being taken. The only one is this guy's talis. He's out of town. I know he's on vacation this weekend. Can I use his talis? The answer is yes. Why? So there, the answer given is a person would like a mitzvah to be done with his property, with his possessions. Here he is, he's away, so his talis is sitting there with no mitzvah, so you're doing a mitzvah. But in deeper than that, a different element is you are gaining, he's not losing. If I put tefillin, if I use that tefillin, he used the tefillin for 10 years, I'm going to use tefillin today, I'm not going to ruin his tefillin. If I do, I have to pay for it, but there's not going to be any difference in the tefillin. I'm gaining, he's not losing, I'm allowed to use the tefillin. I think US law or secular law would say I have no right because it's your property and I have no right to touch your property. And when we're looking at the foundation of law is protecting rights, that is true. That should be the case. Can't touch another person's property. However, when the basis of the law is Sisa Yashav, do what's right and do what's good, then yes, as long as I know the person is not losing and I'm gaining, then I have that right. I can do that. I'd be very careful because, like Herman mentioned before, that there are many variables within each case. So I have to be sure that the person is not losing. So in the case of a talis and tefillin, the Shulchan Aruch says that is an extra reason because people want a mitzvah to be done with their possessions, with their talis and tefillin. But in other cases, I have to be 100% sure before I take that type of action. Okay, are we good? Anybody have questions? Everyone's just on mute. Okay. Okay, so let's move on to case study. I think it was C and D. Yeah, C and D. The Wi-Fi in the parking lot. And before we go into the Wi-Fi in the parking lot, it's very important to note, and this is going to be this lesson and all the lessons we're going to learn, is that there is a law, there is in Jewish law a statement that says Dina de Malchusa Dina, that we are required to follow, to obey the law of the land. And the law of the land sometimes has a whole different perspective than Torah law. And therefore, if the law of the land says A, we have to follow it. Even if the Torah gives us allowance, now, if the law of the land goes against the Torah, then we follow the Torah. And if the Torah says, do not eat pork, and the law of the land says today you have to eat pork, hey, so we follow the Torah. But if there's no conflict, it means that in Torah law, I'm allowed to. But secular law, American law, not secular, but American law says I'm not allowed to, and I live in America, then I'm not allowed to, because I have to follow American law. That's what Torah tells me to do. Right? So that's very important to know. But so we're going to be discussing basically Torah law. If we were living in Israel under Sanhedrin, this would be the law. Right? And there was Wi-Fi, this would be the law. So in case study C, which was the unauthorized Wi-Fi. The relevant question here is whether, where is it here? Yeah, Michael. The question here is whether Michael's usage of his neighbor's Wi-Fi would cause any damage. Now, if Michael is paying by the gigabyte, or if using his Wi-Fi is going to slow down his, his connection, there's no question we're not allowed to. Not allowed to do it. He can stop me from doing it. However, today, home Wi-Fi connections usually don't charge by the gigabytes. And if we know that if he didn't make a password on his Wi-Fi, either he doesn't care or he just doesn't know about passwords, and he's out of town, let's say. So we know he's not losing anything. In that case, there wouldn't be a damage. It would be, I would gain, he wouldn't be losing anything, and perhaps that would be permitted. Again, not in America. If American law says you're not allowed to, you're not allowed to. But simply from the Torah law, which is based on do what's right, Michael should not have, my neighbor should not have any complaint against me for using his Wi-Fi if it's not going to damage. It's not going to affect the neighbor. Okay. How about case study D? Case study D was parking your car in your neighbor's driveway. It's actually interesting. It came up this Pesach. My mother-in-law was here for Pesach. And somebody posted on Facebook, actually a neighbor across the street, posted a picture on Facebook from their porch of themselves. So you can see my mother-in-law's driveway in the backyard, and a car is parked behind her house. The neighbor parked the car, knew that she was away for Pesach, and parked the car in back of her house. Is that a problem? So it seems pretty clear that Jewish law would allow, in that case, Sarah to park her car on the neighbor's side of the driveway, even if the neighbor doesn't know about it. Now, of course, if the neighbor said no, or when the neighbor becomes aware of it, that's already incurring a loss because he feels he loses some authority over his property, but he doesn't know about it. We know he's out of town. We know he's not expecting any neighbors. He tells us before he leaves that, check up on my house because nobody's going to be there for the next week. Whatever reason, we know that there's no one else expected there, then technically speaking, I will be allowed. And more so, the neighbor would not be able to get any compensation when he finds out that I was parking there for a week. No question. If a neighbor told me specifically, don't use my Wi-Fi, don't park my car there, because whatever reason he feels that he's going to, get a loss, whether it's psychologically or whether it's in his mind, whatever it may be, then we're not allowed to. No question. But on the other hand, if there is no intrusion or it's extremely minimal, which is again negotiable, depends what that means, then it's then falls into the category of this one's gaining and this one is not losing. It is very, very different from secular law, how secular law would rule in such a case, because secular law has no concept like don't follow the people of Sodom. I mean, it's not what it's all about. It's all about a person has protected interest, a person's rights are protected, and therefore they can stand on their right regardless of what the right thing to do is. Sometimes protecting our rights is not the right thing to do. It's not being a mensch. But secular law, when it comes to rights, is not looking at who is a mensch. It's not what's right to do, but the preservation and the defending one's rights. Okay, so that's another contrast between Jewish law and secular law. Now, recommended conduct. Again, the Jewish law will not compel an individual to suffer a loss in order to allow benefit to a second party, but it does also give us guidelines when this is expected on an ethical basis. Let's take a look at this case, which is probably going to blow your mind. And I'll explain why it's not necessarily applicable to you and I on a daily basis, but this is an interesting story. Rabbi Bar Chana's barrel of wine was negligently broken by the porters he hired to transport it. Rabbah seized the porter's cloak as a payment for the damage. The porters complained to Rab, who instructed Rabbah, give them back their cloaks. Rabbah asked, is that the law? And Rab said, yes, as stated in the verse, in order that you follow the path of good people. Rabbah returned the porters their cloaks. The porters complained further to Rab. We are poor and we labored all day. Now we're hungry, have nothing to eat. Rab told Rabbah, pay them their wages. Rabbah asked, is that the law? And Rab responded, yes, as stated in the verse, and observe the ways of the righteous. So we learned earlier that the general rule that one isn't obligated to go beyond the letter of the law if it's at a personal expense. This seems to be at a personal expense, right? He hired porters. They were negligent. They broke his barrels. And here, what is Rav telling Rabbah? Give them back their clothing, pay them their wages. Hey, I'm losing something of this. Do I have to be a nice guy? So the answer to this question lies in the verse that Rav quotes when he tells Rabbah to pay them. Follow the path of the righteous and the good people. Observe the way of the righteous. Means he wasn't obligated. Your average person is not obligated. But he's telling him, you're Rabbah. You're righteous. You're a righteous person. You are expected to do more than the average person. When the Torah says, act in the way of the righteous, who are they referring to? Rabbah, they're referring to you. You should be the example. So go beyond the letter of the law. The Torah is asking us to go beyond the letter of the law. Can't be compelled to do it, but come on, Rabbah. There's a beautiful story of Reb Zusha. He was a student of the Alter Rebbe. Poor man. I mean, as they say today, he didn't have a pot to pee in. He really had nothing in his house. And his daughter was getting married. And they put together some money. They bought a piece of cloth and they gave it to a seamstress, who was also poor, to make a dress for the bride. And the seamstress worked for a few weeks. And when they came to pick up the dress, this is the mother and the bride, came to pick up the dress, they saw the seamstress crying. And why are you crying? Because I have a daughter who's also getting married the same day as you're getting married. And I'm looking at this beautiful dress and we don't have money to buy my daughter a dress. And she was crying. So they felt so bad for her that Reb Zusha's wife and daughter says, don't worry, you can keep the dress. You can keep the dress. And they came home and Zusha asked, so where's the dress? He told them the story. And Reb Zusha asked his wife and daughter, did you pay the seamstress for the few weeks she spent working on the dress? So we pay, of course not. We gave her the dress. And Reb Zusha says, no, you have to go back and pay her. Because these last 2 weeks, and she was working on the dress, she was relying on the wages and the money she would be getting to buy food and for her household. You gave her the dress, that's nice, that's wonderful. You're a wonderful person. It was a wonderul gesture. It was a big mitzvah. But it doesn't take away the fact that you have to pay her. Again, it's not, you can't compel, but Reb Zusha said, I expect of us to be at that level, to go beyond, way beyond the letter of the law. That means if one is not losing and the other is gaining, no question. We have to allow the person, because that would be Sodom-like, not to give it. But even in a case where I am losing something, but somebody else is going to gain, as much as possible, I should try to put myself in that category. Not just don't be like Sodom, but even greater, be a righteous person. And righteous means not just doing what's right, but going beyond the letter of the law. So in figure 1-2 on page 26, we have the 3 different degrees in doing what's right and good. Number 1, obligations specified by Torah explicitly, explicit commandments, such as those detailed in figure 1.1, those are obligatory for everyone. B, doing the right thing in favor of a fellow when no personal expense is incurred, such conduct was made legally binding by rabbinic law. And C, doing the right thing in favor of a fellow despite personal expense or loss. Such conduct is not legally obligatory, but is nevertheless encouraged. This is what we should strive to do. So it's 9 o'clock. I said, we'll finish 9 o'clock. We're going to finish, but we sort of got a taste, whether we agree or not with the details, we got a taste of the source of Jewish law and the legal system, the civil and the criminal system, and how we've come to these conclusions. Next week, we're going to learn about if a person did wrong, does repentance help? Does repentance have any role in the legal system? Or should it strictly be a personal matter? So we'll talk about rehabilitation, teshuvah, and we'll explore some very surprising ways in which Jewish law facilitates it. And over the next 5 weeks, we're going to have different discussions. I think I have, if you have the book, it may be in the beginning of your student book. If not, we have the student books coming in this week. So if you'd like to continue the course next week, let me know and I'll make sure to get you a student book. So the lesson 1 was beyond good neighbors. Lesson 2 is beyond restitution. Lesson 3, beyond taking offense. Lesson 4 is beyond personal freedom. Lesson 5, beyond lawful ownership. And lesson 8, beyond presumption of innocence. These all have interesting Jewish twists to it, as we saw today. So wishing you all a good night. If you want to stay on and ask questions, you're more than welcome to do so. For those who have to go, have a good night. And this is being recorded, so I will be sending out an email with the recording. I'm going to stop recording now. So those who want to ask personal questions,